welcome to Outside the Veil. This is the third episode of the True Ghost Stories, and I'll be doing something a little different. Normally I relate stories that have been shared with me directly. However, this will be a historical account of a paranormal event reported 130 years ago. What makes this an interesting story is that it was published in the Sacramento Daily Union on December 1st, 1883. It also involves one of Sacramento's leading business persons of the day. I cannot for the life of me figure out why this article was written. There just weren't that many articles in newspapers written about ghosts in the early days of Sacramento. Unless it was in conjunction with some holiday or event, normally it just wasn't done. It's important to note, though, that spiritualism was a movement that ran from about 1840 through 1920, so there was an interest in this kind of story. With regards to spiritualism, around 1897 the spiritualist movement was claiming 8 million followers and comprised mostly of middle to upper class segments of society. Much like today's paranormal movement, the spiritualists didn't have any real organization or leadership. The movement eventually lost the bulk of its followers due to scandals involving fraud and charlatans. And once many of these mediums were outed and some of them were arrested, people began to distance themselves from the movement altogether. Like with most movements, there was always a few hanger-ons, and there are some people that still belong to the spiritualist movement today. This story contains details from the original article, as well as some additional historical research about the people involved. So, there's room in the time machine. Let's take it for a spin. So, I'm going to put the settings at the location, 190 J Street, Sacramento, California. Controls aren't very precise, so we're going to hit right around 1860, and let's go. John Polhemus was a well-known druggist who had a shop in Sacramento during the gold rush. Like so many before him in 1849, he had come to California from New York. But unlike most of the miners, he ended up being a successful businessman and community leader. He is better known in numismatic circles as J.L. Polhemus, the man who counterstamped coins with his name. Each coin that entered his till would be stamped with J.L. Polhemus, druggist, 190 J Street, Sacramento, California. In those days, 190 J Street was located on the corner of 7th and J. From all accounts, it seems that Polhemus was a sensible man. He sat on community boards, was a member of the Independent Order of Odd Fellows, and seemed to have been quite wealthy. He had many business and real estate dealings, several of which were in San Francisco. He and his wife were often mentioned in society columns that tracked the movements of the upper class. Life was good for the Polhemus family. As was often the custom, Polhemus's elderly father lived in the house with the family. He eventually died of natural causes and was laid to rest. We'll never know if his death had anything to do with the events that occurred, but a short time later, the family started hearing strange noises in their home. The noises escalated to objects moving. Almost every night, Furniture would be thrown about the house. Couches were toppled and end tables knocked over. Books and other small items would unexpectedly fly off shelves and go crashing into walls. One can only imagine how disruptive this was to a family in the 1800s. There was no television or radio to mask the sounds. Back then, families often huddled around a piano or other musical instrument and sang together. It's hard to harmonize while you're trying to avoid getting hit by a book or a vase. Incredibly, this was just the start of things to come. Bedclothes were pulled from drawers and phantom sounds would make it almost impossible to sleep. Locks would jiggle and doors would slam. Occupants would hear the sound of heavy footsteps using the interior stairway. The entire family was terrorized by unseen forces. When they could take no more, Mr. Polhemus gathered up the family and moved them into the Crescent City Hotel. The Crescent City Hotel was located on J Street between 6th and 7th, not too far from the Polhemus' residence and next door to the shop. Being a man of action, Mr. Polhemus was not about to let an angry spirit or demon have its way with his home or personal possessions, at least not without a fight. He elicited the assistance of Mr. Hook, one of his clerks. He instructed Mr. Hook to go to the house and sleep in one of the guest rooms. Polhemus failed to mention anything about the family's experiences to Mr. Hook, and only advised him to be observant and report back in the morning detailing anything he had experienced. Mr. Hook arrived at the house, a little bewildered, but glad for the fact that he was able to have such a nice house to himself for an evening. Upon entering the house, he thought he may have misunderstood his boss since he heard the distinct movement on the second floor. Since he had no idea who might be there, and not wanting to startle any unexpected occupants, he called out,
"Hello? I'm Mr. Hook, the clerk at the store. I'm coming into the house by invitation."
He listened for a reply but got none. Instead, all he heard was complete and deafening silence. In his mind's eye, he was sure that somebody was standing somewhere, completely still, as not to even make the floors give away their presence.
"Hello? I'm here with Mr. Polhemus' permission. He's given me the keys, you see?"
Still, there was no response. Just an uneasy silence. Hook grumbled to himself. How curious. He walked upstairs and cautiously looked around, only to find one of the rooms was in a shambles. The mattress was pushed off the bed and things were strewn about the room. As Mr. Hook assessed the situation, a book suddenly fell off the shelf, causing him to jump. Damnation! His mind raced from one plausible explanation to the other. Must be a rat. Rats wouldn't be able to push a mattress. Is there a burglar? Maybe he's still here. Now he was less concerned with the possibility of scaring an innocent person, and more worried that his life was in jeopardy. Come out, you coward. I'm armed, and I will use deadly force. A single board creaked in the hallway, causing Mr. Hook's fingers to tingle and his heart to race. Damn you! You asked for it! He armed himself with a candle holder and raced towards the sound. There was nothing there. Nothing. He laughed at his own actions, thinking how he was scaring himself. Oh boy. I just need to settle in and get a good night's rest. Mr. Hook decided to take a good look around and just ensure that he could get rest easily when the time came. After checking each room and locking the front and back door, he retired to the guest room. The house was much larger than his and seemed to swallow him whole as he lay in the darkness. Noises he was not accustomed to caused him to study and analyze what they might be. A ticking clock, a rider and horse passing by the house, a barking dog, and then the door to his room burst open, shut and burst open again. Holy Jesus! It was as if the wind entered the house. Items swirled around the room, some of them pelting him where he lay. It was as if the whole house had come alive. Hook was now more afraid than he'd ever been in his whole life. This was worse than any childhood nightmare he had ever experienced, because this was really happening. Is this what his employer had wanted him to encounter? A quick thought entered his mind. Maybe Polhemus had made a deal with the devil, and he was his sacrifice. He had worked with a man too long and knew this wasn't true. Still, it seemed cruel that he would intentionally subject him to this kind of treatment. Mr. Hook jumped from the bed and ran to the front door. He fumbled at first and then quickly opened the door and then stepped out. Closing the door behind him, he barely remembered to lock it. Hook returned to his own house, partly because he did not want to disturb his employer and family at such an early hour. Don was just making his presence known, and he himself was feeling exhausted. He also feared he could not easily explain what had just happened, and might look foolish. Mr. Hook was not a cowardly man. He was not one to have fanciful hallucinations of spirits. He decided that a little shot of brandy at his own home might cast some light on his experience. He would get a few hours of sleep and then talk to J.L. The next morning, Mr. Hook showed up at the Crescent City Hotel and met with Mr. Polhemus. He told his boss he had been treated very roughly during the night and was forced to flee at dawn. Initially, he said he would not return to the house, but agreed to return only if Polhemus would come with him. A plan was devised, and the two men returned to the house the next evening. They entered the house and secured the door behind them. They searched the house from the furthest corner in the attic to each cabinet in the kitchen. Nothing was left unsearched. Once they were quite sure there was no one in the house, they began nailing all of the doors and the windows closed. This would ensure that no one was able to sneak in without their knowledge. This took a great deal of time and effort, and once they were done, they blew out the lights and both got into bed. It didn't take long before the sheets were torn from the bed that they were laying on. Polhemus grabbed the sheets and pulled them back on, but no sooner were they back in place were they torn away again, this time out of reach. They heard the doors in the house slamming open, closed, despite being previously nailed into position. The house seemed to be in full assault on their senses. It felt as if the devil himself were there, and as the noises got louder and louder. The men noticed the sound of birds that could be heard hooting all around them. Despite it being dark, the sound of a huge flock of birds enveloped them. It was so loud and bizarre it caused the men to want to run from the house, but they didn't. The sounds of footsteps were also prominent in and around their room. It sounded like a large male, wearing heavy boots, walking on the wood floor right next to them. There were taps, knocks, scratches coming from all around them. The world had gone crazy. Furniture throughout the house was moved and tossed about like toys. Curtains were ripped down. Items on the shelves and mantels were laying about the floor. It looked as if there had been a drunken brawl in all of the rooms. Once everything had settled down, the men got up to investigate. They noted that all of the doors and windows were still securely fastened with nails and had not actually moved. They checked the house again and felt confident that no one except them had been in the house that night. They could not explain the incidents, but from that day forward, the house was known by people in the area as the haunted house. Mr. Polhemus moved his family out of the house and never returned. Other people had lived in the house from time to time, never for very long, and the stories eventually faded. One night, the house caught on fire and burned to the ground. No one was hurt or injured, and it seemed that put an end to the story of the haunted house. Of course, we don't know that for sure. As it often does, history seems to swallow up facts and make details fuzzy. J.L. Polhemus owned many houses, and it's not clear where his house was located. All we know, it was on either J or K Street in Sacramento. Perhaps it's better if we don't know. We don't really want to stir up anything we can't handle. People still dig up an occasional old coin now and then in Sacramento. Most have no idea what the J.L. Polhemus stamp means and when it was done. Hardly anyone knows that in the early days of Sacramento, a well-known, well-respected citizen was run out of his own house by a poltergeist. I found this story interesting for a couple reasons. It wasn't uncommon for newspapers to print tales of fiction from time to time, but they always listed it as such. This story was included with another one, and the article was simply entitled Haunted Houses. The article was published well after Halloween, eliminating the possibility that the paper was attempting to do a seasonal piece for entertainment value. The other haunted house in the article was reported to have been on 4th and M Street, which today would be 4th and Capitol Mall. I suspect that the story might have been the brainchild of J.L. Polhemus himself, and was just another one of his bold marketing schemes. That would make sense, except that he died December 17th, 1866. If you visit the old Sacramento Cemetery on Broadway, you can find his grave there. The events described in this tale are what we commonly refer to as poltergeist activity, a noisy ghost, or a spirit capable of moving things and making noises. It's generally believed by those involved in scientific studies of the paranormal that most poltergeist cases are caused by a single human, often referred to as an agent, who is responsible for seemingly numerous occurrences, often violent. The human agent is usually profiled as a female adolescent who is experiencing some kind of biological or emotional upheaval, and for the most part is completely unaware that they are the source of the poltergeist activity. I've never really completely been sold on the idea of this, especially as it being the only cause for poltergeist events. But let's just assume for a minute that it is. In this case, who is the agent for the Polhemus house? It's unclear who was living in the house at the time, so we don't know if there was any adolescents residing in the family. It's also thought that sometimes adults can be agents. Even so, was Mr. Polhemus the agent? Well, probably not likely, since Mr. Hook experienced the same events while alone in the house. And Mr. Hook wasn't even present when the first events were experienced by the family. So that discounts Mr. Hook and Mr. Polhemus, and there's really no other suspects at this time. It wasn't included in the recreated account, but several spiritualists of the time attempted to communicate with the spirit inside the Polhemus house. No one ever claimed that the spirits responded to their attempts. There were no wrappings on the wall, no Ouija board manipulations, nothing. In fact, they deemed it to be a dumb spirit. I'm guessing that's what we would call a residual haunting in today's terminology. A residual haunting is more like a recorded event that plays itself out in front of people but does not seem to have any knowledge of the living that are present. It's kind of an event that's trapped in time, or as some believe, an emotional energy that is somehow recorded by the surrounding environment. However, poltergeist events generally do not fall into this category and tend to be more interactive. The skeptic response to this would probably be something along the lines of, well, the reason nothing tried to communicate with anyone is that there was nothing there in the first place. You know, perhaps that's true. Frankly, I've come to some concerns over this tale. Mostly it's the fact that the story was published long after the incident was to have occurred. And it also can't go without mentioning that the most credible person that had first-hand knowledge of this event was Mr. Polhemus. And he had been dead for 7 years at the time of publication. The dead rarely refute statements made about their previous lives. This story also reminds me of a more recent urban legend about a haunted house in Sacramento. There is a house located at 22nd Street and 8th Street. For years, local paranormal enthusiasts have referred to it as the Martinez House. And there's a whole litany of stories told about the previous occupants, murders, and other horrors. When you look at it, the house is right out of a classic ghost story, complete with wrought iron fences and gargoyles. If you research it, you can find numerous articles on the internet about how haunted the house is. The only problem is, the house isn't haunted. The owner has made several public statements asking the paranormal community to leave him alone because there are no ghosts, at least not in his house. Not only are there no ghosts, but I know from my own research, no one named Martinez ever lived in the house. There is no historical record of anything unusual occurring there. There's no crime sheets. In fact, there isn't even a record of anyone even dying at the residence. Despite numerous solid debunking, paranormal people just refuse to accept the fact that the story is an urban legend. It's probably fabricated solely on the fact that the house looks like a stereotypical Hollywood haunted house. Does that mean that the Polhemus house haunting is a fake? Well, no, not really. What it means is that any story, even one in a newspaper, has to be viewed with some skepticism, especially one published in 1883. All of the witnesses are long deceased. Many of the facts are shrouded by the mists of time, and there's no sources listed in this story either. Whether the shortcomings are the result of poor journalistic practices or it's just a story based on urban legend, it doesn't really matter. It's still an interesting tale of the paranormal, staged in real history about real people. I can only hope that 137 years after I'm dead and gone, someone is telling stories about ghosts and using my name. Maybe the real spirituality in this is that for a short time, J.L. Polhemus and Mr. Hook were brought back to life and will live each time you remember this tale. I want to thank you for listening to my humble show. If you liked it, please forward it to a friend or family, or save it and listen to it with a friend, maybe on a dark or stormy night. If you have a story you'd like to share, send me a note at Konadave, that's Konadave, at surewest.net, or go to OutsideTheVeil.com and use our comments page. This is Dave Mace, and I'll meet you here next time, Outside the Veil.